Welcome to the pilot edition of Small Time Nooks, where we look at stories about interesting people or fascinating events between the Big Bang and the 21st century. Today we will be taking a look at Englishman Edmund Curll, an 18th century rogue publisher and peddler of fake news. Let's dive in. The printing press. In 1450, from Mainz, Germany, with his European prototype printing press, Johannes Gutenberg brings to the Western world its publishing revolution. Churches and universities are among the early adopters, and presses are soon operating widely around Europe. Within 30 years, the printing machines are active in 110 countries. Within 60 years, 40 million volumes of works are created, and the new way of producing literature fast tracks to Renaissance. In the centuries that follow, religious, educational, and administrative material circulate widely. A new information distribution network carves a map through the continent. Knowledge has never been more accessible. UK publishing laws. Much like the internet of today, the advent of the printing press creates a wild west of unauthorized publishers working in an almost lawless new media sphere. Between 1695 and 1708, the UK government ignores pleas from the Stationers' Company, the main publishing guild, to update centuries-old archaic libel laws. At the same time, increasing amount of printing presses have made these already weak laws almost impossible to police. The authorities decide to switch tactics and stop looking for illegal presses and start suing booksellers after they have published seditious or obscene titles. Edmund Curll. In the early 1700s, a young London bookseller and publisher, Edmund Curll, takes advantage of these conditions and uses innovatively dubious approaches to running a shady publishing business. He wages a famous decades-long publishing war with celebrated poet Alexander Pope, a member of the Scriblerian group of satirists. Curll is overly practiced in the art of non-consensual manuscript publication. He is involved in many legal cases, some of which create the basis of the first UK Obscenity Libel Laws. Childhood. What we know about Curll's early life is based on his own autobiography. He was born in 1683 and grows up in St Giles in the Fields, close to Covent Garden, which has recently become a focus of the London literary set. He receives a grammar school level of education. Grandmother Curll reads him fictional stories and encourages him when he passes them off as his own creations to his classmates. Around 1696, again encouraged by his grandmother, Curll finds himself selling books from a stall in the Covent Garden market. Most of what we know of his early life is derived from Curll's own autobiography, and, as we shall soon discover, believing Curll's word is an unreliable practice. We do know that he gains valuable trade experience from his first employer, bookseller and publisher Richard Smith. Curll is trained to typeset, copy print, and taught how to stitch and bind sheets. He finds out from Smith that as a bookseller you can sell both theological or learned titles as well as sensationalist literature. His employer introduces him to the practice of taking on non-juror clients, some of whom will eventually become Curll's own clients. Non-juror refers to people, particularly of higher status, who have refused to pledge allegiance to William III and Mary II since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. From Smith, Curll also learns about holding book auctions from libraries of recently deceased gentlemen. Smith also teaches him to turn a profit by shrewdly republishing obscure and unpopular texts into Latin and then encouraging the auctioneer to inflate the perceived value of these so-called rare texts. At 22 in 1705, Curll marries a local woman, Anne Rowell. Publishers and their apprentices of the time are usually part of the Stationers' Company, but despite working with the older bookseller for almost 10 years, Curll gets one chance at joining, but fails to appear at the investiture ceremony. Instead, he chooses membership of a more ancient cordwainers' company, a guild of shoemakers, for the majority of his career. In 1706, Edmund Curll's name first appears on a Richard Smith imprint. Curll in Business. The publishing industry is already rife with mock imprints, false dates, and fake titles. By 1707, Curll is ready to apply his unique and devious approaches to the publishing world. The whole area around Covent Garden has become a popular choice for others of his trade, as the growing literary market lives and frequents the area. It is composed of younger readers, affluent legal students, theatre audiences, and the more progressive thinking Proto-Latin Quarter in St. Martin's Lane. Curll does not stray from these surrounding neighbourhoods for most of his career. Curll and Anne have a son, Henry, in 1707. The same year he opens his first publishing house. That year he publishes a poetry collection by Matthew Prior, one of the more distinguished writers of his day who also dabbles in salacious literature. Curll churns out previews of upcoming horse races, a cockfight, and twopenny pamphlets. He soon shows his taste for debauched material when he publishes the intimate details of a case of sodomy, which includes letters from people involved in a scandalous legal battle. He puts his copyright experience to use when he produces the first of many editions of the Earl of Rochester's works, the practice of passing almost identical texts off as new editions of various out-of-copyright titles is habitual throughout his career. He does not shy away from royal gossip and issues the memoirs of the Marquis de Langallery, which is basically a collection of rumours from the French, Spanish and Bavarian courts. Curll uses his partnerships with publishers of good standing and then passes off unauthorised copies of their reputable clients' titles. He does this repeatedly with many writers, but most notably in these early years with Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, and another member of the Scriblerian satirist group. It is thought that Swift, at some stage, is complicit with Curll for publicity and marketing purposes. In spite of these infringements, Curll's business expands. Another quirk of Curll's is to obtain the wills of recently deceased people of note. He would then announce a forthcoming biography and put a call out for additional stories. Once produced, these biographies are often simply made up of the unusually unauthorized additional material that he has managed to collect. Dr. John Arbuthnot, a third member of the Scriblerian satirists, names this practice of Curll's a new terror of death. In short, Curll is one of the earliest purveyors in dubious and sometimes outright fake news. Booksellers use the London press to advertise their upcoming publications. Curll adds his own cruel twist to this practice. Not only does he promote his own publications, but he uses the columns to viciously belittle his competitors. He manages to work in legal grey areas and as close to copyright laws as he can. To this end, he procures well-known writers' unpublished manuscript using nefarious methods and then adds them to his forthcoming titles and promotes them unashamedly. He would brashly challenge any upset poor authors to prove their case, knowing that the effort to do so was financially beyond them. He proudly declares his citizenship of London on many of his books, but despite living in the politically influential City of London constituency, he rarely takes any interest in politics. Curll versus Pope. In 1716, Curll illicitly obtained some poems. There are varying accounts about the order of events, but the following facts seem certain. Pope, he threatens to and then actually publishes court poems claiming the celebrated poet Alexander Pope as one of the authors. Curll agrees to a meeting at a local tavern where Pope and his editor fail to talk him out of retracting court poems. They then spike Curll's drink, which induces no more than a subsequent bout of vomiting, yet Pope claims that Curll has died and publishes a full and true account of a horrid and barbarous revenge by poison on the body of Mr. Edmund Curll, bookseller, 1716. Curll has touched a nerve. This begins their lifelong feud. Pushing pornography limits. In 1718, Curll's association with pornography has reached such a level that Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, coins the term Curlicism for any bookseller who sell similarly outrageous literature. In 1724, Curll publishes a translation of Venus in the Cloister, a French title involving a sexual love affair between two nuns. Up until then, pornography titles demanded that the fictional purveyor of eroticism be punished for their activities. The prosecution has difficulty pinning a pornographic charge on Curll's translation, as the relationship here is consensual and no punishment is necessary. Nevertheless, he is hounded and harassed for years about this title, but continues his disreputable publishing ways. Sadly, Edmund's wife, Anne Curll, dies in 1724. Another round with Curll, Pope and Swift. In 1726, Curll is once again provoking both Pope and Swift. He publishes Miscellanea, which includes stolen essays from both writers, as well as a set of inaccurate explainers to Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Curll claims the author of the explainers is this Venetian Signor Corolini, but many suspect that it is simply a pseudonym for Curll himself. In Pope's case, the letters used in Miscellanea were written in his youth and of an embarrassingly comedic and sexual nature. Their feud burns on. Convicted in court, Curll continues his publishing duels and the establishment in too many ways to list here. But by 1727, he feels the walls of justice closing in, and so he publishes an apology for his wayward strategies, and without a shred of shame he also publishes a second edition of Venus in the Cloister. This is the last straw, and he is arrested pending a trial, leaving his son Henry to mismanage the business for a few months. On closer inspection of the case, the courts realise that the outdated statutes contain no actual obscenity laws, so instead they charge him with libel. Out of prison, he publishes an apology, which turns out to be an advertisement for memoirs of a client he met in prison. These memoirs include state secrets. As a result, in 1728, he is properly convicted under the common law offence of disturbing the peace for his combination of obscene and seditious publications. This is the first conviction for obscenity in the United Kingdom and sets a legal precedent for subsequent convictions. Curll and Henry spend time in prison, and Curll is sentenced to stand with his head and hands locked into wooden pillory stocks at Charing Cross for an hour. A strike from Pope. Pope and his Scriblerian satirists think they have heard the last of Curll after this, but they are wrong, and he is soon back to his old dishonest ways. 3 months after the pillory incident, Pope publishes a scathing satire of Curll and his associates called The Dunciad, in which a host of shameless Curll's dunce writers gather in the Strand for an opening ceremony of their high heroic games. Curll hits back with a flurry of pamphlets exposing Pope's possible embarrassing motivations and pens a return title called The Curliad, despite many names from Curll's writing room being outraged at being drawn into this feud in such a public way. The rogue publisher himself enjoys the free marketing provided by the ongoing public battles. 1730s, the feud takes a turn. At some stage in the mid-1730s, Curll publishes Pope's address along with details outlining his house and gardens in the format of an official property selling guide. After this, the too-long decade fight takes a strange turn. In an effort to highlight his forthcoming collected letters, Pope pays proxies to approach Curll, who successfully sell him fake Pope letters. Curll publishes the letters, and on the back of that free publicity, Pope distributes his authentic correspondence to a primed audience. True to form, Curll promptly produces 5 more fake volumes of Mr. Pope's literary correspondence, which damages Pope's reputation once more. The poet tries to have the fake correspondence suppressed by the House of Lords, but fails. Curll gets the last laugh, and the stunt once again heightens his public profile. Between these bouts with the Scriblerians and other literary figures, Curll continues his shady approaches to his work. In 1734, he marries his second wife, Elizabeth Bateman, while his son Henry drops out of sight and eventually dies before Curll. He has moved 10 times during his career. and all to the beat of the most lucrative market, the Covent Garden Environs literary crowd. Also in 1734 he opens what is to be his last location, Rose Street, Covent Garden. The evidence suggests that Curll is producing theatrical biographies, antiquarian and medical books offering dangerously suspect cures, but by 1740 his list of books has dwindled down to a sad series of bawdy and titillating titles. Curll versus Pope, the final round. In 1741, the courts raise a point from a historic case between Curll and Pope. It is in relation to Curll's publishing of Pope's correspondence without permission. The judge delivers his final word on the matter. The author of a letter and the recipient are joint owners of the said correspondence. This ruling against Curll stayed on the statutes for almost 200 years. Pope dies in 1744, and with him, so does their feud. The end of Curll. With little or no publishing work for the next 3 years, Curll dies on December the 11th, 1747, in London, aged 64. He's buried 2 days later at St. Paul's, Covent Garden, which stands in the heart of the district where he operated his cursed publishing career. His widow, Elizabeth Curll, survives him until 1756. Legacy. Some accounts of Curll's activities, which can be found online today, border on the entertainingly romantic, but his legacy leaves for literary detectives of the early 1700s is largely a negative one. Curll's decades-long habits of authorship misattribution, misleading advertising, fake editions, false dates, and heavily recycled new editions have had repercussions that even he may not have foreseen. His suspect publishing fingerprints can be found in over 1,000 literary items, which often create difficulties for modern bibliographers attempting to catalogue the era. When they encounter his involvement on titles, for example, several of Signor Corolini's questionable keys to Jonathan Swift novels are still for sale on Amazon today. Unfortunately, it is highly likely that the corrupt Curll would have been very amused by the state he has left early 18th century literary history. How he would have used the internet does not bear thinking about. Please find all sources in the description. Thank you for listening.